tell me where the Ambassador Hotel is? I thought it was on this block, and I don't recognize it.
The following is a reenactment of a speech given September the 17th, 1987, for St. Cecilia's Music Club in Stillwater, Oklahoma. I was allowed to choose my own topic, and the topic I wanted to talk on, and did, was Mr. Edison's phonograph as a crystal ball. I used a lot of transparencies projected on an overhead projector, and I'm going to signal where I used them or where I changed transparencies by clicking my fingers like this. Shakespeare's 64th Sonnet. When I have seen, by time's fell hand defaced, the rich proud cost of outworn buried age, when sometime lofty towers I see down raised, and brass eternal slave to mortal rage, when I have seen the hungry ocean gain advantage on the kingdom of the shore, and the firm soil win of the watery main, increasing store with loss, and loss with store, when I have seen such interchange of state, or state itself confounded to decay, ruin hath taught me thus to ruminate. The time will come and take my love away. This thought is as a death, which cannot choose but weep, to have that which it fears to lose. This sonnet can almost be about music, because indeed time brings ruin to all things, including beautiful sounds, particularly beautiful sounds, because the sound is just a vibration of air, and when it ends, it's finished. Sometimes when one is enjoying something, indeed that enjoyment is flavored with a foretaste of loss, as he says that one might weep to have something which it fears to lose. Before there was sound reproduction, this was especially true of music, because once a performer was over, it was gone forever. But there were attempts to preserve music, and before we look at the phonograph, we need to review the earlier efforts to preserve it. One of the ways to preserve music was to write it down, but that hasn't helped that much. Although music was enormously important in ancient Greece, only 5 mostly complete pieces and 9 fragments survive, and they were only recently rediscovered in the late 19th century, and more recently still decoded. They used a notation which assigned a different letter to every pitch that they used. They could turn the pitches one way or another, changing them, raising them, or lowering them. They used a completely different set of symbols for rhythm, and they had 2 systems, really, one for vocal music and one for instrumental music. Here's one of the complete pieces, a short epitaph, recorded and issued as authentic in the 1950s, about 1955, I believe. before you get the idea that you've been hearing something that's authentic from 2,000 years or 2,500 years ago, before you believe that, I need to tell you about a problem. The problem was the Greek theorists had many different systems of tuning, and no one knows which tuning is appropriate. It's quite a problem. They even had very strange scales, which the family of them was called inharmonic scales, that used quarter steps. Here's an example recorded on harpsichord of one of those theoretical scales.
The enharmonic of Archytas.
Well, that was quite different than the sort of scale we use. It would be very difficult to sing in that. I don't even really think that our current crop of singers could handle it. They made another recording playing the same epitaph using one of the ancient tunings that wasn't quite so dramatic, but if you were a musician, these pitches seem horribly out of tune.
Psychelos song. Intonation in Ptolemy's diatonic hemiolan.
If one were a singer, that would be very difficult to sing. I imagine if I tried to sing it, it might come out that out of tune, but that would be accidental. To sing that well, to sing those pitches very well would be remarkable indeed. I really think that since we're so unsure about what tunings would be used, and really about almost all performance aspects of this music, for all intents and purposes, despite the fact that Greek music was enormously important in that civilization, it is lost. There was another method of preserving music that was employed in India, which we'll call the guru method. And this method meant that a particular composition, the style of singing it, would be handed down from teacher to student. And in India, Vedic hymns are being chanted today supposedly in the same manner that they have been chanted since 1500 BC. Here is a performance of one of these chants that is 3,500 years old, supposedly.
Om Hiranyavarnam Harinim Suvarnarajatasrajam Chandram Hiranmayim Lakshmim Jatavedo Mavaha Tam Mavaha Jatavedo Lakshmir Manapagaminim Yasyam Hiranyam Vindeyam Gamashvam Purushanam Ashvapurvam Rathamadhyam Hastinada Pravodhinim Shriyan Devi Mupahuaye Shri Rama Devi Jushatam Kausosmitam Hiranya Prakara Mardran Valantim Triptam Tarpayantim Padme Sthitam Padmavarnan Tamiupahuaye Shriyam Chandram Prabhasam Yashasajvalantim Shriyan Loke Devajushtamudaram Tam Padminimim Sharanamaham Prapadde Alakshmir Menashyatan Pam Rune Adityavarne Tapasodhijato Vanaspatistava Vrikshota Bilvaha Tasya Phalani Tapasanudantu Mayantarayascha Bhaya Alakshmi.
My problem with that is I really find it hard to believe that in 3,500 years there wouldn't be a period in which it was badly taught, or in which there wouldn't be a time in which there were changes made. It's really hard for me to believe that. But if it hasn't, indeed, if the performance style hasn't changed, this is the oldest preserved music that I know of. There was another method in Japan, a method which employed the guru principle to the nth degree almost. It's the most extreme example of guru preserving technique I know of. It is in the ritual court music of Japan known as gagaku. There has been one family employed since 900 AD whose single profession is the accurate performance of the ritual and court music and dances of the emperor. It is probably the oldest authentic ensemble music in the world. The instruments used are what we would call oboes and what we would call flutes. Also a very interesting mouth organ with many pipes. The pipes are in varying height and they stick up out of a gourd. It's the only harmony instrument used in the ensemble. There are 3 sizes of drums, a zither, a lute, and various other things. Here we have an instrumental ensemble that isn't really like our instrumental ensembles. As you'll hear, they're not playing several melodies, they're playing simultaneous variations on a single melody. Until 1956, the people of Japan didn't hear this. This was the private music of the emperor. Since 1956, there have been public performances. Alas, only about 24 members of this family are left. They have all been declared human national treasures. Here's the opening section of a piece, gagaku court music, probably 1,000 years old. In Western civilization, we preserved our music by a kind of notation which began just about the time or shortly after the gagaku tradition was started in the 11th century. Our earliest notated music uses symbols called neumes, and these square-shaped notes were probably just the hand signals of, representing the hand signals of the choir leader. The relative height above the text shows the relative height of pitch. These, on this particular manuscript that begins the writing of music, are called heighted neumes, mainly because they are just written in various heights above the text. Now, these were not meant to be read. These were to remind them of tunes that they were that they already knew, that had been taught to them by their choir leader. Since they had to sing so many different pieces, these markings on the page remind them of the tune they were supposed to sing with it. In the 12th century, a line was added showing the location of, in this particular instance, the note F. It still is impossible for us to decode this because we can't tell what these other pitches were. In the 12th century, finally, they achieved, thanks to a wonderful teacher, Guido de Zero in Italy, they achieved 4 lines, a wonderful invention. And this same manner of neumes, square neumes, and lines is was used until very recently by the Roman Catholic Church in notating their chants and their liturgy. These 4 lines were quite enough for the range of the singers they used, and it was only recently that they stopped using it. But in this manuscript of Summer is a Coming In from around 1240, we can see that even though 4 lines had been invented, it wasn't the standard. This particular piece, which, by the way, is the earliest known example of a piece of music with 6 melodies simultaneously, this particular piece of music uses in one place 6 lines in one part instead of 4, or instead of 5. In 1501, Petrucci, another Italian, printed the first music, and it's just beautifully, beautifully printed. His standard of printing is almost the same sort of relationship as Stradivarius violins to later violins. The earliest examples were enormously high quality. Still, however, music is not printed the way we print it. This is a piece of choir music, and the soprano part is printed complete in a couple of lines at the top of a page, then follow the tenor's complete part, the alto's complete part, and the bass's complete part, and they're not aligned. If you were singing that as a piece of ensemble music and you got lost, there was no help because there was no alignment. Each part was printed separately, which is very difficult. And as you will see in this manuscript of Bach's own handwriting, even in Bach's time, notation was not exact. Bach would have flunked my music theory class because this particular key signature, instead of just using 2 sharps, the pieces in B minor should be just using 2 sharps. He uses 3 because he thought you should sharp every F sharp. Moreover, one thing that I don't allow in theory class is to use a single ledger line for many notes. And Bach, when he used ledger lines, tended to run them all together so they became a single line. And it's really not very good notation by modern standards. Even in contemporary scores, when certain rhythms are printed in Bach, that is not what you play. In this example from one of the English suites, you'll find triplets in the right hand against quadruplets in the left hand, or actually dotted 8th note and 16th. And one would think that's a strange mixture because they don't really mix, but if you look at the bottom of the page, you see that what you actually do is you learn to perform them, the left hand also as triplets, because there was a convention in his time when you had triplets and quadruplets, you perform the quadruplets as triplets. So even from the printed page, we can't really read accurately what Bach notated, and this is true of all notation in some ways. If we look at modern notation, we find the old system stretched to the limit. Notation only is a somewhat inexact way of preserving music. Today's new music can't use the old symbols for our new sounds. There is, however, another means in which some of the sounds of the past have been preserved absolutely accurately, and that is the instruments that survive. In Denmark, in Frederiksberg Castle, is an organ built in 1610 that is remarkably preserved. In a very remarkable chance, it has not been changed in the slightest since 1610, so its sounds have survived the passage of time. Here's a recording made very recently of this ancient unchanged organ, playing variations on a dance written by a composer named Svelink, who lived at the same period in which the organ was built. And it doesn't sound like a normal organ. It sounds, the sounds are more like those of a Renaissance consort or small instrumental ensemble. One mustn't think, however, that one can just go to Europe and hear many sounds that have been preserved that way. That was a very unusual circumstance because usually congregations tried to keep up with the times and constantly repair their organs, so they constantly changed. However, in the 1700s was a wonderful invention called the hurdy-gurdy. And in this sort of street instrument, it was a marvelous invention because an accurate performance of a piece could be obtained merely by turning a handle. Inside the box were pins on a revolving cylinder that opened valves, permitting the air to arrive to reeds, and these reeds were again activated by the same handle that blew air through the reeds. So you had an instrument that was self-contained, that all you had to do to operate it was turn a handle. 100 years later, in the early part of the 1800s, we saw the invention of the music box, where pins on a cylinder were activated by a spring mechanism, and they turned the cylinder, on which were little metal prongs. These in turn hit a comb which had prongs on it, larger metal prongs, and these vibrated. And I would like to share with you a particularly personal treasure, the Larson family music box, which was a wedding present to, I guess, my great-great-aunt. It's hard to describe that relationship, in 1892. She got it as a wedding present, and they immediately went to live in a sod house near Assaria, Kansas. And it was evidently a very rough place in which to live, but this music box added a touch of elegance and a touch of civilization to their pioneering. There are 6 pieces on it, because which was a wonderful invention, because the cylinder moves slightly sideways as it turns. Then they were able to put many more pins on and get 6 different pieces on this cylinder. After it plays the 6th, then it snaps to the right, and here is the part of the Larson family music box. These sounds are a very accurate performance of sounds really notated in 1892. But the giant breakthrough was the phonograph. Oddly enough, the recording of sound was achieved before it was reproduced. Around 1857, a Frenchman named Leon Scott built a phonautograph, which was a horn with a thin membrane attached on the narrow end and a bristle attached to this membrane, and then it was brought in contact with a smoked glass, later a piece of paper. And as sounds were made into the horn, the membrane vibrated, as did the bristle, and those sounds were notated. An image was produced of the sounds, really, but he didn't intend it for anything other than the study of sound. Also, before the phonograph was really invented by Edison, in April of 1877, another Frenchman named Charles Cross deposited a paper in the Academy of Sciences in Paris in which he proposed the reproduction of sound, but alas, he didn't build a model of it, and he failed to test it. But in December of the same year, 1877, in one of those curious coincidences that seems to happen, Edison himself came independently to the sound recording as an offshoot of research into high-speed telegraphy. And that brings us to the subject of the main part of this talk, Edison. You might not know that the inventor of the phonograph, ironically enough, was deaf. He couldn't hear. Here's his account of his deafness. He said, "I became deaf when I was 12 years old. I had just got a job as newsboy on the Grand Trunk Railway, and it is supposed that the injury which permanently deafened me was caused by my being lifted up by the ears from where I stood upon the ground into the baggage car. After the earache finally stopped, I settled down into steady deafness." Well, ironically enough, Edison considered the phonograph his greatest invention because of one very sad fact. He passionately loved music. Here's a picture of him listening to the wax phonograph, the later development of his earlier phonograph. He said, "I haven't heard a bird song since I was 12, but I can hear anything on a phonograph." And seems strange to us, but he could hear on a phonograph, and as you see in the picture, it's because he was using earphones, plugs which he put into his ear which reproduced the sound. That enabled him to hear it. He himself considered his deafness an advantage on working on the phonograph because he wanted to hear music again and other things so badly. It drove him to work on the phonograph and the phone very hard until it worked well enough for him to hear it. He said his deafness also drove him into reading continually, and he was a voracious reader throughout his life and was very thankful he was. He also said that his deafness shut him off from small talk and rubbish. He said it was a business advantage because he always put things in writing since he couldn't hear. They had to do that. And funnily enough, he even courted his wife with it. He taught her telegraphy, and he actually proposed marriage with it, and she accepted with it. After they were married, they would attend the theater together, and she would tap on his wrist a summation of what was being said, so he could enjoy theater. When he gave his sketches of a phonograph to his assistant, John Crucy, to build, Edison himself really didn't think it would work. But this is ironic because it was the only one of his inventions that worked the very first time. 50 years after it was first tested in 1927, Edison recounted the first words that he spoke in December of 1877. Here is a recording of that.
Here's Mr. Edison in a reminiscent mood in 1927 to mark the 50th anniversary of his invention of the phonograph. He gave a repeat performance of the first words ever recorded. Here they are, as picked up from the soundtrack of an Edison movie made in Llewellyn Park, New Jersey.
The first words I spoke in the original phonograph. A little piece of practical poetry. Mary had a little lamb, its fleece was white as snow, and everywhere that Mary went, the lamb was sure to go.
It did work, and he thought it, however, merely a toy, so he didn't work on it. After that, for 10 years, he put it aside. But the sad thing is that recording does not exist. What he had done is he'd taken a piece of tinfoil and wrapped it around a cylinder, and that was what the first sounds were recorded on. And immediately after recording it, he took it off so that he could examine it under the microscope, and he couldn't put it back on. And since he couldn't put it back on, that sound was destroyed. And he then didn't work anymore on it because, as I said, he thought it was a toy. 10 years later, in 1887, Edison vastly improved the recording medium by using wax cylinders. And the next spring, Edison's English representative, Colonel George Garrard, took one of the machines to London, where he recorded Robert Browning, Alfred Lord Tennyson, Gladstone, Florence Nightingale, Sir Arthur Sullivan, and even a concert of Handel's Israel and Egypt, which was given at the Crystal Palace. And here is a reproduction from the newspapers of that time in April, showing the recording instrument recording in the Crystal Palace. These earliest of all recordings that exist were lost until very recently, in which they were found in Edison's West Orange laboratories. The earliest recording I possess of these is Sullivan, of Gilbert and Sullivan, in a message he sent to Edison. And here is Mr. Edison, recorded in October 1888.
October the 5th, 1888.
Now listen to the voice of Sir Arthur Sullivan.
Dear Mr. Edison, for myself, I can only say that I am astonished and somewhat terrified at the result of this evening's experiment. Astonished at the wonderful power you have developed, and terrified at the thought that so much hideous and bad music may be put on record forever. But all the same, I think it is the most wonderful thing that I have ever experienced, and I congratulate you with all my heart on this wonderful discovery. Arthur Sullivan.
The next year, another one of, Edison's representatives, Theodore Wangeman, went to Europe and recorded royalty and celebrities with the hidden agenda of exploiting them commercially in the United States of America. The people he recorded didn't know that. They merely thought that they were sending greetings to Edison. And in November of 1889, Johannes Brahms himself was recorded in Vienna. Alas, 45 years later, that cylinder was given to an English friend of Brahms who did not think very highly of recording and didn't think very much of the cylinder, and just put it out on a shelf and let dust and moisture erode it. A German corporation examined it in 1935, and they pronounced it inaudible. There is nothing of value on the cylinder whatsoever. Modern technology has clarified it somewhat, and we will hear, although this is the worst recording you will hear ever probably, very faintly, Brahms giving a greeting to Edison, saying, "Greetings, Herr Dr. Edison, I'm Johannes Brahms," and then he plays an excerpt of Hungarian Dance No. 1, and I'll show you the transparencies both of what he said and of the Hungarian Dance No. 1 as it plays. Alas, this recording is almost inaudible, but at least we can hear a little of it. At first, commercial recordings were mostly vaudeville, and we won't cover them tonight. But there is one fact about this very earliest of cylinder phonographs that might interest you. It also recorded. It didn't just play, it also recorded sounds. And it's in some ways like the modern cassette player that not only just plays cassettes but also records sounds. Ethnomusicologists, or people that study music of other cultures, noticed that immediately got these instruments and headed out all over the place. Anybody that was going on safari from Germany was sent with one of these cylinder phonographs to record music from all over the world. And also in the United States, ethnomusicologists were busily recording music of Native Americans. And I would like you to hear an 1897 recording of Omaha Indians. And what we will be doing is hearing music sung by people who actually lived that authentic lifestyle. This was music that isn't just a remembrance of how things used to be. This is part of their life. The next important development in recording industry was made by a man named Emile Berliner, who was a German immigrant living in the United States. He started working on the phonograph around 1888, and by 1892, he had developed a phonograph that used flat discs instead of cylinders. It was not exactly like the discs we have today in that the spiral groove ran from the center to the outer edge instead of reverse that our phonograph records do. Not surprisingly, though, the first disc recording that exists is of a drum and fife band. They continually tried to record orchestras throughout this entire period, but it was difficult to manage because the instruments weren't that loud, and to fit themselves into this cone business just didn't work. Violinists can't really sit that closely together, or they'll start jabbing each other in their eyes with their bows when they play on the G string. Instead, brass and wind and percussion instruments recorded very well, so fife and drum is a very logical recording. This dates from 1892. It is the first disc recording, and it's the H.C. Schultz Drum and Fife Band. Probably the most famous ensemble of that time, however, was Sousa's band, and yes, they did make many recordings. Strangely enough, Sousa himself didn't like the recording medium, and he frequently, particularly towards the end, had assistants conduct the band instead of him. It's very strange to me, though, because his big popularity also happened at the time that the phonograph was developed, and his recordings sold very well. They were one of the most popular things. One can't help thinking that there was a link in his popularity in the fact that people could hear him that couldn't be in the same city he played. His band was formed in 1892, just about the time that recordings were going off, and I will play you an example of the earliest recording I have of Philip Sousa's band. It was made January the 3rd, 1896, just 4 years after he formed it, and it's called the High School Cadets March, and you can see very clearly that this is a high-class ensemble. They play very well, and it is the most successful sort of sound that we find on the early recordings, these bands. I can't help thinking, wondering whether present-day schools all across the United States would even have marching bands if it hadn't been for the strange fact that bands were the easiest thing to record well and successfully on these early recordings. Here is the earliest recording I have of Sousa's band. I would like to share some more of these early recordings. I just have to. The next recording we'll hear in some ways makes contact with Robert and Clara Schumann. And it does that by a wonderful pianist named Ilona Eibenschütz, who was a piano student of Clara Schumann and lived in her home after Robert died. In 1903, she made a very few recordings and immediately retired thereafter to get married and never played piano again. She lived, I believe, until 1960s even, but alas, the recordings she made were never issued, and these particular recordings were her own copies, which were recently dubbed and made available. And she is quite an amazing person because not only was she friends of Clara and Robert Schumann, Clara Schumann, but she was also a good friend of Brahms, and she premiered the piano pieces Brahms wrote, Opus 118 and 119. I have a recording of her playing Brahms' second waltz. On this manuscript of Brahms, you can see that the notes are really hard to read. She might have even read from this very manuscript, but for the recording, we'll follow a modern score. And here is a person that premiered Brahms' piano pieces, Opus 118, 119, playing a Brahms waltz. That wonderfully clear recording was made in 1903. 1 year later, 1904, Camille Saint-Seans made a recording of great interest to me, improvising a cadenza to his piano concerto, Africa. It's very rare, this is the only recording I know of someone from the age in which piano cadenzas were improvised. This is the only recording I know of someone playing one, and it's amazingly excellent. At the end, you will hear him yell to the engineer, asking if the machine had stopped before he had finished playing. But as amazing as that recording is, perhaps the most amazing wonder from that period, 1903, 1904, comes from around 1905. There was a mad man named Edwin Welte who lived in Germany, and he invented a wonderful way to reproduce sounds that's related to the player pianos. What it had was a piano that recorded sounds on it, and what he'd done is he put light carbon prongs underneath the keys and the pedals, and beneath those prongs a trough of mercury, so that when the key was struck, the prongs dipped into the mercury, completing an electrical circuit, which was recorded on a piece of paper, a large roll of paper. And what this recorded was the speed with which the keys went down. And as those who know piano tone know, that's the whole ball game. Everything comes from the speed with which the key is pushed down. This was notated on these paper rolls and fitted into an upside-down piano with a felt finger for each one of the keys of the piano and a felt foot for each one of the pedals, that you could roll over any piano and it would play with exactly the same touch that was recorded on it. It was lost after World War I, and after World War II, it was rediscovered. A Vorsetter was discovered in Texas, and some rolls were smuggled, no kidding, smuggled out of East Germany, almost like a Hollywood myth, and flown to Texas, where these recordings were made in 1962 to 1963. We will hear Alexander Scriabin himself, the great Russian composer, playing an Etude Opus 8, number 12. It was recorded around 1912 to 1913 on this robot pianist. That is one of my favorite recordings. It is so passionate. Yes, he misses a few notes, but it doesn't really matter. The performance is so electric, and it is amazing to hear something recorded in 1912-13 that is so extraordinarily alive. But of course, it was really from the recording of it came in 1962. So it is stereo. I have provided with this lecture a chronology which has been handed out. This printed chronology of recording devices, both of mechanical things such as music boxes and phonographs and tape recorders and later synthesizers, I provided so that I can skip talking over it. I just want to skip lightly over that and go into other developments. Before the radio was developed, the phonograph became immensely popular. It was found in homes all over by the 1920s. But just about the time that the microphone and the amplifier was invented and treated to successful experiments, shortly after that, radio came about, and it did affect the sensation that the phonograph had caused. Edison said that the radio wouldn't kill the phonograph because people would want to choose what they heard and when they heard it. And he was right. The phonograph continued to grow and change. Its development was interrupted by World War II, and also, concurrently with that, strikes by the music unions. But after World War II, there was an amazing growth of the industry. In 1946, 257 million recordings were sold in the United States. In 1947, 400 million recordings were sold in the United States. It just mushroomed. And shortly came the invention of non-breakable discs of slower rates of speed, 33 1/3 revolutions per minute, which allowed many more minutes on a side, stereo, and now digital systems in the late 70s. All these things brings us up to the present. And of course, there was a parallel development of tape recorders and synthesizers. These last two really have enabled composers to create music directly. without depending on performers to interpret their music. Truthfully, we have been using recordings tonight as sort of a crystal ball to gaze into the past, much like a fortune teller gazes into a crystal ball to see the past, the present, and the future. And what I see in that crystal ball is that we have reached a state that has never before existed on our planet. We can now hear music from almost all portions of the world, and from many periods of history. We can hear the great performers of the recent past, and we can hear the greatest performers of the present. We have all probably heard more excellent performances than Mozart did in his whole lifetime. And our current crop of youngsters should be the best trained musicians ever yet produced because of what they heard. But this goal has not been reached, probably because of a subject I don't want to talk about tonight, because of the lack of support that the arts which has in the United States, and really the low esteem in which it's held. Some of the most talented young people I see do not make careers in music because they want to earn a comfortable living. We won't go into that. But instead, by using the phonograph as sort of a time and space traveler, let's travel a bit. I would like to share some of my favorite sounds. And one of my most favorite sounds, in fact, the sound which always makes me smile, is the Renaissance crumhorn. Yes, early music is one of the wonderful gifts of the phonograph. There are not that many excellent performances of early music around to suit me, and I'm so glad that I'm able to buy early music on recordings and hear all these wonderful sounds. And probably helped by the availability of good recordings of early music has been a growing awareness of historically appropriate instruments. Music really sounds best to me and a lot of other people when it's played on instruments that are appropriate to the time in which the music was written. Some of the early performances in the beginning of our century in which people did play early music, but on the totally wrong instruments with the totally wrong approach, really do in retrospect seem kind, but a little ridiculous. And how ridiculous some of this sounds is paralleled in some ways by a wonderful joke which reverses the situation. It doesn't play old music on modern instruments, but plays modern music on old instruments. And the reversal is immensely ridiculous. Yes, that was Tchaikovsky's 1812 overture, and instead of using cannons, they used cap pistols. Another thing that I'm so thankful for is actually I'm thankful to a person, Alberta Stool in Lawrence, Kansas, who introduced me to the wonderful pianist Dinu Lipatti, who died in 1950 at a very early age. Fortunately, before he died, he made a few recordings, and those recordings are pure gold. Here is one of the more difficult to find of his recordings in his last concerto concert just a few months before his death. It was in the spring, and he died in December the same year. He played 3 encores, and here's the last of the encores, a Chopin Etude in G-flat major, opus 10, number 5. How thankful I am that all of his recordings survive, because otherwise I would have never heard him. Another wonder is a recently rediscovered recording, a private recording, never issued commercially, made by George Gershwin, rehearsing Porgy and Bess in July 1935, more than a month before the piece opened in its first performance. He made the recording to check his orchestration. He was always a little shy about his orchestration. He made the recording to see if it worked. He recorded about 20 minutes of the music. Here is just the beginning, and you'll hear George Gershwin playing the piano, and at first, George Gershwin singing.
George Gershwin is conducting and will announce these portions of his new opera Porgy, recorded for the first time and played for the first time.
We will start with the piano solo at 5 bars before 9, because the piano has a solo lasting about 2 minutes, which we will not waste time with now. 5 bars before 9, scene 1.
that's a short portion of a wonderful recording made with the original cast. I'm also thankful for some nature sounds. Colin Turnbull, a wonderful ethnomusicologist, in the mid-1950s, put a tape recorder outside of a pygmy camp in the Ituri forest of Zaire. And he recorded a forest that, alas, no longer exists in the same state. You will hear not just insect sounds and bird sounds and animal sounds, but you will also hear pounding of bark for clothing. They wear bark clothing, and so they pound bark. And they also, you will hear a thumb piano. Now, the pygmies themselves don't make thumb pianos. They borrow them, usually without asking, from other villagers, non-pygmy villagers. And sometimes they return them, and sometimes they don't. But they always change them to make them the sound they want, the way they want them to sound. And here is a very rare recording of what the ancient primeval forest sounded like, and a pygmy camp, the oldest people in Africa. Another sound that I am very grateful to the phonograph for is the humpback whale. Here's a recording of the humpback whale. It's amazing that we can hear sounds like this. They've existed for a long time. I find these recordings very enormously interesting. My dad says that it reminds him a bit of bird calls, and that makes me think of this big, big animal, in some ways like a giant canary. But I am particularly grateful for recordings of music of other cultures. The traditional culture of Kampuchea, Cambodia, was destroyed totally in 1983. That is the traditional of the court music by atrocious genocide. This music no longer exists, and if it weren't for recordings, we couldn't hear it. Before 1970, the palace employed 30 woman dancers, including the Princess Bopha Devi, plus 160 pupils and an orchestra. They were all executed by 1983, except, I believe, for one dancer who is now one-legged, who still lives. Fortunately, a few recordings were made before 1970. Here's the beginning of one of their pieces that they danced to. Alas, these few recordings are what exist of their music. It is unfortunate that not only do recordings preserve music, but they help destroy music and cultures. An example is found in New Zealand, southeast of Australia, in the music of the Maui. We will hear a piece recorded in the late 50s of a haka, a posture dance of Wirangi. And the story is that Wirangi, his wife was stolen by a neighboring tribe, so he, his four brothers, went to this place, and they stayed in the courtyard that night, and they composed a song in this village. And the next morning, when they performed it, at a certain signal, they rose up and killed their hosts. It's a posture dance, a war dance, and here it is recorded in the 50s. Now, these people have been exposed to Western music, and they love it, and so they've changed their music. They've even added a guitar. Here's a more recent recording of the same group of people, not the same people, but the same tribe, recorded more recently, and you'll see the effect. What we have just heard is an example of acculturation, the disappearance of a culture when brought in contact with our more advanced one. The shocking truth is that the music of most non-Western cultures is recently extinct. Traditional music has been abandoned for their version of our popular music. It's because of the popularity of radio, film, TVs, video, cassettes, all these things which show them a life they want, and they abandon their traditional music for these Western instruments. It brings us to the future, and there's some bad news and some good news. The bad news is that the traditional cultures which have existed for thousands of years are almost completely gone now, and their music only exists on hard-to-find recordings. We are moving towards monoculturalism, which means one culture has dominated the entire earth and all of these other cultures are disappearing. It's a tragic loss to me of ideas and options in music. It is not healthy. And unfortunately, I see recordings used by giant corporations as a means of manipulating the tastes of an audience for profit. Edison had thought of this sort of thing in terms of the automobile, and he thought it was a good idea. Here's his words. It was necessary to create an understanding and appreciation of a higher standard of living and a desire for it, a demand to get more out of life on the part of several million individuals who would have been extremely satisfied with what they had. Well, that's what he said about the automobile. Alas, what the business orientation of this thing has meant that giant corporations, whose only ethic is sizable profit, control what recorded sounds are available to us. And many, many valuable recordings are not accessible because they're not profitable to be issued. It really limits our access to our recorded heritage. And let us not think, by the way, that even though our music is recorded, that it'll last forever. We mustn't think that. It won't. The shelf life of tapes, for instance, is enormously limited. Tapes cannot be stored near any electrical currents that will ruin the magnetic signals on the tape, nor near any magnetic sources. Like, please never lay tapes on a loudspeaker, because loudspeakers are magnets and they destroy the tapes. Nor can they be exposed to extreme heat, extreme cold, moisture, dryness, and they really can't be stored on anything metal. Tapes must be stored on wood, not metal. In fact, one should redub, even keeping them in ideal conditions, one should redub valuable tapes every 10 to 15 years. That's a lot of bad news, but there is good news in the crystal ball for the future. I see in the future marvelously well-trained musicians who will study the recordings that are available of the music of the past for insight on how to perform it and be much better at performing stylistically accurately music of the past. I see in the future musicians who will study our own recordings made in our own day for guidance in performance of music written during our times. We will, for the first time, have a chance to have our music be heard accurately of recordings which survive, because they can tell from the recordings how our music was performed. Students will continue to be able to study their own performances by listening to them, and that improves their learning. They hear their own flaws. Students and lovers of music right now can do something that is absolutely marvelous that was not possible in the past, and that is to listen to the entire output of a composer in chronological order. I have done that to a few composers. I've sat down in one weekend, listened to everything Stravinsky wrote in chronological order, and the same for Ravel and quite a bit for Schoenberg and other people, and I strongly recommend doing that. I'm going to continue doing that because you get a grasp of the composer's style and growth that you cannot possibly get in any other way, and it's wonderful for giving a love and an understanding of so much of their output. Although by the industry less interest is given to making home recordings available, for instance, contemporary cassette players don't have microphone inputs apparently, one can find some and still preserve the voices of loved ones. There's nothing like a recording of someone you love very much, because somehow sound triggers as many remembrances and as many vivid presences of that person as does a photograph. And there is a wonderful thing that I think more parents ought to do. I think when their children first start making sounds and when they first start to talk, they ought to record the kids on tape. And then when the kids are all grown up and think they know everything about everything, present them with those tapes as sort of a gift to remind them that their origins in speech were somewhat humble. But the most wonderful possibility of recordings that I see in the future is exemplified by the music of Stillwater's own Myron Dale McKinney, a retired art faculty member who was one of the pioneers of kinetic art and then dove headlong into the creation of tape music. His tape compositions are absolutely amazing. He was not a trained musician, he was an artist and a sculptor. And so he attacked the idea of making a long piece of music in a totally unique and wonderful way. I have learned a great deal from hearing his compositions, and I would like to close this program with a recording of one of his shorter pieces to show what is possible when creative people have access to recording machines.